Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our last session of day 2 of CALC 25. And I'd like to welcome Kelleen, who's going to be presenting our final session. Take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today. I do have to let everyone know that unfortunately, my co-presenter, Symphony Bruce, was actually put on a jury duty case. So we had to pivot a little bit since she's actually in proceedings as we speak. So Symphony and I actually recorded our presentation for y'all. And so I'll be playing that video, but then I will be here and we will have time for a Q&A. And I will also be monitoring the chat during the video as well. But please do know that we put just as much care and time into the presentation. It's just pre-recorded. We also wanted to jokingly say that I did break my toe while we were recording this. So if you hear any like weird stops and starts, that is why. So it's been a little bit of an adventure to get here today. But we're really excited to be here, and I'm going to go ahead and start that recording. But like I said, I'll be monitoring the chat, and we do have time set aside for Q&A. So I'm going to share now. We did already test this, but please let me know if y'all are not able to see or hear. I am starting now.
Hi, welcome. We're excited to be speaking with you all today about a topic that's really important to us, problematizing the concept of library anxiety. I'm Kelleen Maluski, and I am an engagement librarian at Sage Publishing. But before I started in this position last year, I was in academic libraries for 20 years and worked primarily as a student success and engagement librarian. I'm also a queer cis woman with chronic illness and dynamic disability.
Hi, I'm Symphony Bruce, the critical pedagogy librarian at New York University's Division of Libraries. I spent my library career working in instruction and reference, and prior to that, I had a first career as a high school English teacher. I use she, her pronouns. Before we officially start our presentation, though, we do want to acknowledge our positionality as United States-based librarians. While we do feel many of the concepts we discuss in our article are applicable to what's happening in the UK, and we know the rise of fascism is not unique to the United States, we do want to make sure everyone is aware that we are based out of and a majority of our references are from the United States. So let's dive into deconstructing library anxiety, how librarian vulnerability built a phenomenon.
Great. So first, we want to start this talk with this quote from Nikki Andrews. When are we going to stop signaling that fear and anxiety are normal within our profession, and instead examine how these narratives are the result of institutions deflecting the need for change? Here, Andrews is referring to imposter syndrome, specifically in library workers. And we see a lot of correlation between the way in which imposter syndrome is expected as a phenomenon in us, to how library anxiety is expected in our students.
How much of this anxiety is about how we operate and our policies and procedures? How much of this signals the values of the library? What does it mean when we expect that both our students and ourselves will be anxious and fearful for skills, experience, and sense of belonging? For today's agenda, we've broken up our discussion into 4 sections. First, we'll discuss the article that we wrote back in 2022 for In the Library with the Lead Pipe, which is sort of the inspiration for this talk. Second, we will review the concept of deficit thinking and how library anxiety as a concept bolsters this same thought process of racism, oppression, and inflicting harm. Next, we will review the foundation of our profession as white niceness and how our acceptance of it further perpetuate cycles of harm. And lastly, we will end on where we are now and where we think we could be.
Great. So, getting started, let's discuss the article. So, we published this article in August of 2022 and in the library with the lead pipe. Much of what we discussed in this space is still applicable today. And in fact, with the worsening of political climates in many countries, and definitely within the United States, we might argue it's even more pertinent that we understand these concerns now more than ever. So, what was the article about, and how did we decide to write it? I, Kelleen, had been formulating thoughts around the concept of library anxiety for a while. I was concerned with my own use of the term and how it might have been dismissing the reality of what my students were encountering in the academic setting. So I started researching the literature more. Soon after that, Symphony published Teaching with Care, in which she discussed how our consultations could be infused with more care and how, due to the debt that our students are taking on, this was a social justice issue. I saw correlations with what Symphony had written about and my own concerns about library anxiety. And since luckily we are friends, I reached out to Symphony to see about a collaboration. The main issues we identified with the concept of library anxiety are that it is used to absolve librarians from more investigation of what issues could be creating anxiety.
If we approach this as a phenomena, as opposed to systemic issues within libraries, then we don't have to research the problems and how to change them. We can just pass this off as an issue, and an issue that most students face. We don't have to question the systems of oppression that exist within our spaces. Additionally, in researching the history and background of the term library anxiety that we had heard so often, it became clear that the scale from the original study seemed flawed. Constance Mellon, who coined the term and later created a scale to measure library anxiety in 1986, we found that no students were ever directly involved in creating the scale or even in defining its categories. In fact, it's not even clear if Mellon herself ever spoke with the students she wrote about. This meant that librarians had made decisions about what students should know and be comfortable with based upon our own conceived ideas, not on actual student experience. Librarians, therefore, lumped all students into one monolith, ignoring that the institutions of libraries are the actual monolith. Library anxiety also works to promote deficit thinking because the scale categories were assuming that if students didn't know how to do something, like find books in the stacks, then they were lacking in some way. There was no discussion of the knowledge and skills students do bring to their research, only if they could execute very specific tasks that the librarians deemed necessary for navigate a library. This ignores the fact that many libraries may not have used a physical library, much less an academic library, prior to coming to their undergraduate schools, or that learning new things is normal. Lastly, we were able to recognize how this approach assumed a neutrality. By assuming that libraries must be inherently comfortable, any behaviors that might indicate anxiety or discomfort must be abnormal, when the reality is that these spaces are not neutral and our classrooms are definitely not. As we were teaching with the biases and based upon concepts like the framework for information literacy that were also written by librarians based upon preconceived ideas of what students should and should not do.
Exactly. So before we get into the weeds here with everything we're going to be covering, we do want to be clear that we understand how subscribing anxiety to a phenomena can be especially attractive to any service profession. When we give so much of ourselves to try and assist so many people, the thought that they aren't getting the resources they need can feel like a personal attack, as if we're not doing something right. In libraries, this can be especially fraught because we work at institutions that claim values such as freedom, access to information, and expansion of knowledge. But in practice, we're founded for a very specific subset of the population. This has meant that over the years, many libraries, in an attempt to offer consistent service and maintain workers' rights, have built strict policies, procedures, and policing behaviors that do not align with the values our profession subscribes to itself. However, these policies haven't just made our resources and spaces harder for learners to easily access or feel welcome into. They have also inhibited creative approaches to change within our profession and have disenfranchised marginalized library workers. Furthermore, the rise in situations such as school shootings and hate crimes within the United States has led to an increased security state in which many librarians look to their own safety to justify further policing and discrimination within spaces meant to be safe for learning, exploring, and creating. This dichotomy only further complicates an already fraught discussion within our profession. So while we understand that these are complex issues and that many times there are real feelings of fear and anxiety for ourselves, we subscribe to the concept of critique as care and know that not addressing these juxtaposing identities head on will only further perpetuate a cycle of vulnerability and harm.
In our 2022 article, Kelleen and I say that we are concerned that the unexamined use of the term library anxiety as a negative condition and subsequent studies to prove its existence further perpetuate a deficit thinking approach to identifying student needs without questioning the role of library procedures and library worker beliefs, values, and actions in producing those feelings, which we still stand by. And considering all of this, it is no wonder that we treat anxiety and confusion within library spaces as a phenomenon. Digging deep into our values, but not confronting the realities of how these concepts have played out in actual library spaces, leaves one grasping at reasons why so many learners would feel anxious in spaces that are so welcoming. Of course, oftentimes they aren't, but to acknowledge that would have to be to confront it as well. From this one study in 1986 on library anxiety by Constance Mellon, the profession has built a way of thinking about our spaces, our work, and our students that absolves us.
So how can we really confront this? First, we think that we need to start asking, instead of why our learners have these feelings, we should actually be asking, why wouldn't they feel this way? When reviewing the literature, what became especially apparent was a reliance on seeing this as a phenomena that was extremely prevalent, but yet only focusing on the supposed symptoms and how we could treat these symptoms. There was very little that criticized the concept of library anxiety, almost nothing that tried to identify causes of these feelings or behaviors, and very little questioning of why the feelings or behaviors were even deemed quote unquote bad in the first place. We thoroughly passed the buck to our students, claiming they had problems with navigating and being comfortable in academic libraries, not that we had problems making libraries feel welcoming, inclusive, and easy to navigate. At this point, there have been many pieces of scholarship that dig into the roots of the profession, the elitism and gatekeeping that is frequent within it. So we ask, why are we continuing to use terminology like library anxiety without confronting the roots of it and the impact it has on the profession? So next we're moving on to looking at deficit thinking. In our article, we make the connection between the concept of library anxiety and deficit thinking. This connection is part of what makes the concept of library anxiety so concerning, as deficit thinking has racist and oppressive underpinnings. Because we don't often have the chance to meet our students and learn about their strengths, the things they want to learn, or evaluate their skills, most of our instruction, and we include any type of instructional interaction in this definition of instruction, is based upon assumptions of what they know and what they need to know. The statements here on the slide represent what we hope would be slightly exaggerated statements about our students, such as students come to college with little research experience, or students utilize resources ineffectively or illogically. But that last quote is from Mellon. And Mellon further said, when confronted with the need to gather information in the library for their research paper, many students become so anxious that they are unable to approach the problem logically or effectively. So considering that, these might not be exaggerations of how we speak about our students. But the point is that no matter who is saying it, these ideas are all essentially false. In the Mellon study, students were at fault for their own quote unquote failure because they didn't tell their instructor that they didn't know things. They didn't admit to their lacking skills and asking for help. But seriously, who does this? And how do we expect them to know they don't have these skills? The deficit thinking model posits that the student who fails in school does so because of internal deficits or deficiencies.
This is not to say that students come to college with all the skills needed to participate fully in an academic, scholarly, or creative infrastructure that is, provided through the university. But the library anxiety framing doesn't allow us to see students as learners or to recognize that students feel anxious in a lot of new experiences in college, like learning to navigate the food hall or how to do their laundry or the ins and outs of using the science lab. Furthermore, library anxiety is often compared to other types of anxiety. For example, math anxiety, where students actively avoid math or tech courses because they anticipate their own failure. And in this case, we recognize that students have often been traumatized by previous learning experiences that showed them they weren't smart enough or good enough at something inherently. We know how damaging these experiences are, but we refuse to believe that we, as in the institution of libraries, could be systemically creating the same for our students. Deficit thinking has roots to the racist belief that non-white or non-European people are biologically, intellectually, culturally, and morally inferior. In her chapter on the racist roots of deficit thinking, Menchaca shows that after science proved that non-white people were in fact human and thus biologically equal, the goalpost essentially continues to move to question non-white intellect, proven wrong through schooling, of course, and towards cultural and moral inferiority. And though these beliefs have changed and evolved over time, we still see evidence of them within the US public education system. Schools with predominantly Black and Brown students are underfunded, and their test scores blamed on a supposed culture that doesn't value education, which is obviously wildly false.
Yeah. And in her 2012 piece, Problematizing Deficit Thinking, Smith says what is particularly disturbing is the way in which social disadvantage is refracted or recontextualized as low academic ability and how it is then worked out in pedagogic practices. The effect of this is an inevitable societal reproduction as the consequence of education. And really adding to this is in 2023, the article, "And Still We Are Not Free: The School Prison Nexus in Higher Education" by Gardner, Wilson, and Bigelow, where they are able to show with empirical data how our schools prioritize policing over academic success, and the ways in which campuses with more marginalized students are targeted for additional security and policing as opposed to increasing budgets for initiatives related to their academic and personal success. While the institutions Gardner, Wilson, and Bigelow are studying publicly list values of robust supports for academic and personal success for their learners, they were able to use policies, procedures, and data from the schools themselves to show how, in actuality, the funding and resourcing for the school did not back this claim. As our response to a natural lack of knowing, coupled with the ways in which stratifications within society replicate within academic institutions, continue to be pushed more towards punishment and less towards a rectification of our values with our practices, how can we expect our learners to feel any form of support in our spaces? And what is more, how much does our own teaching via deficit thinking mirror these beliefs? And I would say that just from our responses to learners who have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and their quote unquote preparedness, for instance. So thinking about how many times have I heard colleagues complain about the incoming classes and how horrible their essay writing or research skills. How are we utilizing this as a barrier to education, as opposed to understanding that our information landscapes are shifting? They will continue to shift. And there are different forms of knowing that should be prioritized outside of the westernized concepts of grammatical perfection. This is not just true for students being impacted by the mass shutdowns in the United States, though. We also see it through constant needling of new generations of learners. I remember as a millennial hearing just how lazy and self-centered all of us were as learners when I was in college. And now I'm hearing the narrative that we are some of the highest producers with the highest level of education, and yet we have some of the lowest pay. So, how are these two different narratives actually able to reconcile with each other? We also see this through the arrests that have been taking place regularly within our library walls in the United States, but we know in the UK as well. So to us, this shows us that we are mirroring deficit thinking within our instructional practices and libraries, and our policies and procedures are further perpetuating this approach.
This all goes back to the very root of our work, the values that are built into our profession that we would rather pretend are not there. And that foundation is that of white niceness. Where does what is deemed acceptable in libraries come from? Well, that's often white niceness. We often claim that our instruction, reference services, and the like are to ensure that students feel more comfortable using the library resources and asking for help later. But in reality, our time with students works to teach them how to fit in with our academic culture, how to behave, how to interact with staff, and how to assume trust with our resources and spaces. The wonderful 2020 piece, Nice White Meetings, unpacks absurd library bureaucracy through a critical race theory lens, citing Tab Hamna to show that while libraries maintain an outward appearance of inherent goodness and egalitarianism, while enacting bureaucratic processes that undermine such claims. Like Andrew, these writers are talking about internal library personnel issues, but these reflect well how we force our patrons to interact with us as well. This is not to say that all policies and systems are bad and should be done away with, but the reality is that most of our libraries function exactly the same way, within reason due to the physical spaces that we inhabit, despite the fact that we all serve different populations.
So Mellon suggested that warmth seminars, teaching opportunities that allowed librarians to present themselves as friendly and helpful while introducing students to library procedures, was one antidote to library anxiety. But we suggest that these warmth seminars, which I would assume a lot of our instruction has taken on, absolves the library of students' discomfort by getting ahead of it to prove that we are so nice and so helpful and so friendly. Through orientations, welcome week activities, and first year experience programs being some of the ways we inherently subscribe to this idea. Now, don't get me wrong, these are all wonderful, but this can be particularly harmful if the warmth is disingenuous, creating a cognitive dissonance for students when they almost inevitably will be confronted with convoluted systems, policies, and procedures. Imagine, for example, that in an orientation, students are bombarded with warmth. They're told to explore and to ask questions and to wonder. But then later on, they have campus police called on them for behavior that was interpreted as inappropriate or disruptive. And we know that this is more likely to happen to students from marginalized identities. And this doesn't just impact our students. It overloads many of our colleagues, especially BIPOC women, with the need to appear nice and kind and helpful. And these are more about appearances than about actual assistance. So what do these policies and procedures actually tell our learners and ourselves? It tells us how to fit and less how to learn. Visual and written barriers to access send messages to our students, in addition to adherence to safety policies that actually prioritize the safety of the few and make the space less safe for the many.
Just as anxiety around learning new things is not abnormal, whether it be in the library, navigating the food hall, understanding how instructor office hours work, the academic library is not alone in its inconsistent messaging between what we want our students to experience and what they might actually experience in our building. But as a campus location, which is often central to the student experience, whether for space, access to resources, instruction and reference, or more, we have a duty to recognize these dichotomies. In our article, we cite a 2018 study of African Nova Scotian students' library anxiety levels and experiences with library workers at a predominantly white institution, where students expressed that about half their experiences in the library were negative. They interacted with supportive librarians that assisted them with their information needs, but they also interacted with unfriendly and condescending library staff that made them avoid future interactions. Our policies and procedures, when combined with the perhaps unconscious deficit thinking bias, prescribed within an assumption of library anxiety, bolstered by our own wish to shield ourselves from our own vulnerability, can have dire consequences for students who use the library and its resources more capaciously than permitted. At the beginning of the school year, my library hosts a wonderful series of events and workshops called NYU Library Welcome, where we table at the many new student orientations, host tours of our expansive building, we facilitate well-attended workshops, and we give out library swag, great pens and pencils and stickers and all the fun stuff. We welcome our new and returning students to the library with excitement and smiles and fanfare, practically screaming that we want you to be here. The picture you see here on the slide is also how the outside of my library has looked since October 7th, 2023. And in the picture here, you can see the front of my building. There are orange barricades that run across the front of the building. These barricades also run across the plaza that is off to the side of the building and the back of the plaza that extends the side of our building. Students at NYU have a long tradition of staging protests and demonstrations of all kinds in the library building, as the top floor holds our administrative offices, aka the university president is on the 12th floor. Like those who came before, students protested war and genocide in the library, and the university administration has since gone to great lengths to tamper student-free speech. These bright orange barricades, third-party guards, extra signage, blocked public-private plazas, increased public safety, the use of the NYPD have been a regular part of my work environment and student learning environment for a year and a half. Students and faculty alike have been banned from the library and other university buildings, have been labeled person non grata status, suspended, and arrested for their activity inside of the library. When I consider the messages sent by these barricades about who is being kept out of the library and who is allowed in, who might be questioned, given a hard time while entering, who might be banned, who might be mistaken for participating in a demonstration due to being in the wrong place at the right time, I wonder which students are self-selecting out of coming to the library at all. Can warmth seminars and good teaching counteract this type of library anxiety? At some point, we have to ask how much the nice, helpful library worker cosplay is hurting our relationships with students, especially if they end up having negative interactions anyway. Perhaps our students have the right response to an environment that has convoluted policies and procedures and is filled with personnel who commit microaggressions or write out discrimination against them. At some point, academic libraries will have to contend with the way our library policies are weaponized against students. And on the screen, I'm using sort of a case study of this sort of highly reported example of one of Harvard University's libraries, where students were banned from the library for 2 weeks following a silent study-in demonstration. The passage on the screen comes from student newspaper, the Harvard Crimson, which summarizes the frictions of the situation well. It reads, "Many of the study-ins were led by Harvard Out of Occupied Palestine, the same coalition of unrecognized groups that organized the 20-day encampment in Harvard Yard, which initially faced severe disciplinary action from Harvard administrators, who argued that the occupation disrupted the university's normal operations and posed a security risk. The study-in protests are of a completely different nature. Now, the pro-Palestine activists read books, watch lectures, and write essays, inviting Harvard officials to discipline them for engaging in the normal operations of a university. And thus, we have students doing a very smart thing, which we might call malicious compliance, but they are also using their library in a way that's probably pretty correct. And this inspired the faculty to do the same. The image on the slide is of a silent faculty study-in support of the students and against the suspensions that they faced. These faculty were also initially banned from the library before their own consequences were rescinded. The student study-in looked exactly like you see in the picture, though. Can we say that these students are not appropriately using the space? What the situation starts is a conversation around how do we appropriately use the library. Much of the article dives into a discussion of what constitutes protest, what makes a disruptive behavior, how does one use the library appropriately, and what should be the consequence of using the library in a not quite right manner. These discussions prompted an entire FAQ dedicated to the rules for protesting in Harvard libraries, a topic which had only been addressed in the university's rights and responsibilities policy for the first time in January 2024 since its inception in 1970, when it was originally drafted, likely after protests against the war in Vietnam. Of the changing library policies, a student organizer said, if there's anything you can trust this administration to do, it is write the rules before our eyes and enforce them in different ways at their own will. We know from years of experience that changing policies are used to criminalize something that was once not an infraction, and in this case, weaponizing library policies against students. I understand it can feel like a big jump to go from topics like circulation policies and Boolean logic to protests and policing. But the policies of our libraries and our actions as library workers provide a through line between the stacks and the streets. Currently in the United States, library policies against disruption are being used as a basis for law enforcement and arrest, leading to the termination of student visas and permanent residency green cards. Yunseo Chung, a Columbia University student who was arrested in the Barnard Library during a protest, is now quite literally being hunted by our Homeland Security for deportation and has had to go into hiding while her lawsuit against our federal government moves forward, all for practicing her right to free speech in a library.
So we want to talk a little bit now about where we are and where we can be. Where does this all leave us? And we don't want to leave today just on a note of the problems. We actually want to talk about ways to move forward. So first, we believe it is the role of all of us to recognize the truth of not just the history of how library spaces were founded, but the reality of where we are now. All it takes is one look at the news headlines for the day or the pictures that Symphony just shared to see that we are still in this reality. It might look differently than it did when the first academic libraries were founded, but the concepts of elitism are the same. And as we just saw, the violence is only escalating. We think that we need to be having honest conversations, and we need to be having these conversations with our students. Here on the slide, we have a quote from Ben-Simon. If patterns of inequality are invisible, they will not be discussed. And if institutional participants do not have a reason or opportunity to talk about unequal outcomes, the problem will not be addressed directly. Covering these topics in the classroom and engaging in actual conversations, discussions, or reflections with students also helps to uncover the true reasons for anxiety in a library. And while this quote on the slide is talking about discussions amongst professionals, we believe we should be having these conversations with our students. Only demonstrating warmth and friendliness to students won't help them build critical thinking, and it only further gaslights them into feeling as if there is indeed a problem with their lack of knowing. What is more, it doesn't fully allow them the opportunity to engage in our information systems, and definitely doesn't prepare them to interact with these systems outside of the walls of academia. So again, while this quote on the screen is about discussing amongst each other, we need to be making this a conversation with our students. Otherwise, we are making assumptions about what the students do and do not know or feel, and thinking about building critical pedagogy into not just into what we teach, but also how we teach it will give us a better understanding of what our students are actually encountering. We are not just here to create warmth. We are here to teach, and warmth isn't the answer to systemic oppression. By not including learners in these conversations directly, we are infantilizing and disenfranchising them.
But we also do need to be having honest conversations with ourselves and each other about the ways in which we placate ourselves through concepts like library anxiety, and also through understanding how our workplaces drain us. When we are feeling afraid, discriminated against, and attacked, our systems are not functioning well, and we are more likely to inform our understanding of our learners with our own biases and needs.
We posit that instead of focusing on services and symptoms, we should instead focus on our users holistically. The time spent researching if students feel anxiety about libraries without actually connecting this anxiety to being specific to libraries might be better used to understand the inequities that are fraught throughout academia and how to help make structural change. But we should also be doing this for ourselves. The work of critique as care is revolutionary, and the need to move our profession out of relying on phenomena to explain behaviors and more towards real connection is important to reframe our current timeline. However, this is, again, not just for our users, it's for ourselves too. Rejecting warmth seminars doesn't mean rejecting relationship building and connection. And while we need to be okay with discomfort, we also need to be caring for ourselves and our learners through this difficult time.
So ask yourselves, where can we find moments of connection and joy? And how can I spread that to others beyond myself?
We want to thank you all for your time today. On this slide, you will find our contact information and a link or QR code to our bibliography for this work. We're excited now to move on to the question and answer portion of our chat.
Okay, so as promised, we are excited to move on to the question and answer portion. And I will happily drop that link in the chat as well, so everyone has access to our bibliography. But these will be on our slides. I believe our slides aren't up yet because of the fact that I broke my toe. I was in urgent care most of the week, and Symphony was in a courtroom, but they will be up soon. We have supplied them. I see a question has come into the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and answer that. But I do want people to know you can feel free to unmute as well if you prefer to ask questions that way. So thank you, Lucy. Lucy, you asked, how do you think the recent emphasis on things like escape rooms and treasure hunts as part of induction activities relates to this? Can these still be useful ways to engage? That's a really great question. And I think, it goes back to something we said in the presentation, which is that yes, these are all great things. I love doing welcome weeks. I love having a table full of swag and stickers. I have done gamification of instruction as well. So I do think that we should still be employing those techniques, but it's again about kind of that intent behind them and is it disingenuous or not? So, you know, if we're having an escape room and everything we're saying in that escape room is, hey, the library is a great place to explore, but we're not preparing students for the fact that there are possibly some policies or procedures that are going to impact their ability to explore, then that's a little bit more disingenuous. And I think it's really easy when we are planning things like that to only want to focus on the positive, right? Especially because we do feel like, you know, this is something, you know, we say a lot, we got that one shot, right? And we want to make an impact and we want people to feel like we are there for them. But we do need to be more honest with our students about how those policies and procedures impact us, but also them. So definitely, that was a great question. Lucy, just let me know if I did not answer any part of it. Oh, and thank you for adding the slides already. That's amazing. Great, thank you, Lucy. Okay, Rachel, are you aware of any real world examples in libraries which are moving towards this different way of thinking? Yes, but I would say, again, it's not the library as a monolith that's doing it. I believe it was one of the talks today, they actually talked about how certain departments might work differently than the library as a monolith does. And so I would say I've more noticed it within specific individuals. So again, Symphony is the critical pedagogy librarian at NYU. So there is definitely a shift at NYU to move towards that. I was the student success and engagement librarian at University of New Mexico Health Sciences, and this is how I practiced my work there. So there are definitely movements towards this. A lot of times you'll hear discussions in the United States about critical pedagogy librarianship, and a lot of those discussions are really talking about some of the facets we reviewed today. But in terms of like problematizing the term of library anxiety, we actually reviewed our citations when we were preparing for this talk because we wanted to update it. And we have seen a growing number of people citing our work in the past couple of years. And so I would also say that there is a movement to start problematizing this phenomena thinking that I am seeing happening as well. And Rachel, let me know if I didn't answer anything. Okay, I see a thumbs up. Yes, yes. Please unmute.
Yeah, I'll mute myself. Well, there was a moment there I could butt in. So as you could probably tell from the chat, I was really taken with Symphony's term about sort of nice library worker cosplay. And it's something that I think I've definitely experienced being in staff meetings where said, well, of course, everyone's really helpful. Everybody's really nice and pleasant in the library. Well, I've also been thinking, not always. But do you have any advice about how you can push back against that in a collegiate way, I guess?
Yes, yeah. So again, we're not here to say it's easy. So I wanna preface with that. And I will own that like I myself as a queer woman with dynamic disability and chronic illness, I had been labeled sometimes as that angry woman when I would bring these problems to the forefront. And so I think while I'll say there are ways to do it collegially, and I'll talk about some of those ways, I also want to acknowledge that there are different privileges at play, and some people are going to be considered differently, no matter what, if they're utilizing critique as care. And that's why we like to really emphasize the care part, though, because for us, I think Twana said this in her talk earlier, we love libraries. Symphony and I both went into them because of how much we love them. And so it's really difficult to have people call us uncollegial or have those kind of things thrown at us when it's more that we're wanting to make sure our learners are actually not having harm committed against them. One thing that I have definitely tried to employ when I am utilizing a critique, though, is, I am trying to make sure that the person I'm speaking with always understands that I am coming at it from a place of, I don't think your intent is negative, but that doesn't mean the impact isn't there, right? And we talk in equity work a lot about intent versus impact, of course. But I do think that goes a long way in making sure you're approaching the conversation that way. Also, owning that you yourself have done these things. I used the term library anxiety all the time before I started before I was like, wait a second, like, why am I using this term? And I dug more into the study, and like we talked about in the talk, it's like she didn't even talk to the learners, like, and we're basing an entire phenomena on this. But I use that term, right? We all don't know what we don't know. That's not just true for our learners. So I think approaching it from that perspective and being vulnerable can be helpful in having these conversations. But I do want to again emphasize being vulnerable where you feel you can trust. Because I will own that I've been vulnerable in situations that I probably should not have been. And so just putting that out there for people, you can't always do the emotional labor. So taking care of yourself as well. Does that answer that question for you? Awesome. Yeah, and
Excellent, thank you.
I love Meg here also said, that they've been thinking a lot about how an emphasis on warmth and friendliness affects our relationship with our teaching faculty, colleagues, and stakeholders, and how we're perceived as experts. And I cannot agree more. And again, this is particularly true for women and especially true for women of color or women like myself. I have a dynamic disability. I use a cane sometimes, and I can see where the reactions I get from people change. And I almost like up that dial on trying to be friendly, and then I'm like, wait. Like, I am also a human being, and I am also, it's okay that I don't just have a smile on my face all the time. And I think that also goes along with how our profession was founded, right? Dewey very famously thought women should be librarians because we had good handwriting and we were caring. And so these issues are not new in any caring profession. And if you are reading about it and talking about it, Veronica Arellano Douglas's work on the subject has been revolutionary for looking at kind of the quote unquote mommy librarian. Yeah. Yeah, we always try to be approachable and then it undermines us. Yeah, definitely. And I've had to be okay not always just being there to be friendly and saying to professors, especially if I'm going into a classroom, I respect your opinion, but you're asking me to come in here and be an expert on this, and so that is what I'm going to do. This is my role and I know what I'm doing. So yeah, it does take some ownership of that. Natalie, do you have any advice on how to build a more positive library experience for students in an institution where there might not be much flexibility to change policies, procedures, spaces? That's a great question, Natalie. And yeah, I see Lucy saying, oh, Dewey. That's a great question. And I actually did do a presentation years ago on building in holistic kind of frames of reference for, making students feel more comfortable in spaces where I didn't have a lot of control. And so I think one of the things to do, which you might have all heard and might be tired of hearing, but I have found it actually revolutionary to internalize really understanding this, but starting small. I can't fix everything in these spaces. None of us can. And it can oftentimes feel like we're constantly like seeing any harm or damage done to our students can want us to think really big, right? We want to think about how can I change this whole thing? But even just having a book display, but instead of just a display, it has a community engagement element where they are filling in information or voting. One I did that was really successful was for Banned Books Week. 3 weeks before, we had a large sheet of paper. Students got to write and vote on their favorite banned books. We had information about banned books. And then the exhibit was based on what they voted on wanting to see in that exhibit. And so things like that are just ways to make sure you can really show students their voices are being heard, even though you might not have control over everything that's happening on campus. Even if you can have control over that one exhibit or that one course where you're really diving in with them, it's gonna make a difference. Let me know if I didn't answer your question enough or if you have any follow-up question to that though. And yeah, and I said that in an earlier talk today, that we're often described as magic, and it's just like, it's not magic. This is a lot of labor. And you know, I love that you think I'm some sort of beautiful witch, but I definitely spent a lot of time on this, you know, and it happens a lot with instruction too. How many times have I spent weeks working on a very intricate lesson plan with learning objects and resources, and I go to teach the class and the professor's like, wow, oh wow, this is just amazing. How did you even come up with this? I guess I don't know. Okay, well, you know, can you teach us again in 3 days? And it's like, no, this was weeks worth of work, right? So we definitely see that play out. And I think getting more comfortable with the word no is a huge part of it. And again, it's one of those pieces of advice that sounds so trite because you're like, yeah, I hear it all the time. But I'm going to be honest with y'all. I did not learn how to say no very well, even though I heard it over and over and I preached it to other people. Learning to say no and to say, hey, this is how I'm going to do something and not asking for permission. Because once again, I am, you know, my last position, I was faculty. I am here to be your equal and to collaborate with you. I do not need your permission to teach about the scholarship that I am an expert on. And so I think, you know, starting to own that, and that's hard. It's really hard in a caring profession, and it's especially hard for those who might be more femme represented, because we've been taught to put ourselves aside. And then going into a caring profession further teaches us that.
Okay, I can't see any other questions in the chat, but I'll just give people a little bit of time.
I love these questions. I know, like, please do, if someone does have another one, feel free to type or raise your hand, but I really appreciate everyone's interactions today and also throughout the conference. It's been really amazing to see. I didn't get to attend as much as I wanted because, again, urgent care, but luckily, I hope my colleagues in the UK, I know the NIH isn't doing great, but hopefully it's better than our situation in the US.
It's cheaper anyway.
Yeah.
Nothing else. Okay, I know as soon as I say, okay, I think we'll draw it to a close, that's when a question's gonna pop up. So I'm just gonna vamp for another 30 seconds. And I don't see any hands up. I don't see any in the chat. Okay, yes, I'm gonna call it there. Okay, so I'm gonna stop the recording, but first of all, say thank you so much for that presentation, Kelleen, and also Symphony. It was fantastic. Really enjoyed it and so much to think about.